the countryside. For many, it evokes images of peace, tranquility, and simple beauty. A place to escape the noise and chaos of the city, to breathe clean air and find solace in nature's embrace. But beneath that peaceful facade lies something older. Something less welcoming. The quiet can be deafening, the darkness absolute, and the isolation can breed a fear that city dwellers can barely comprehend. Because when you're miles from anywhere, with no streetlights, no close neighbors, and the nearest help is a lifetime away, you're truly alone with whatever the night holds. Tonight, we delve into the shadows of the rural landscape. We're not talking about fiction, about campfire tales spun for entertainment. We're talking about experiences that are claimed to be chillingly, undeniably true. My boots crunched on the familiar gravel of the trailhead parking lot, a sound that usually brought with it a wave of quiet contentment. I'd been hiking the trails around the Abingdon Gap shelter for years. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a ritual, a reset button for the soul. The woods here felt like an extension of myself, predictable, welcoming, a place where the only surprises were the occasional deer or a new wildflower pushing through the soil. I knew the switchbacks, the roots that like to trip the unwary, the spots where the sunlight filtered just so through the canopy. I could practically navigate them blindfolded, which, ironically, would become a terrifyingly relevant thought later. It was a Tuesday, quiet as expected. The sky overhead was a brilliant, clear blue, the kind that promised perfect hiking weather, not too hot, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. I checked my pack, water, snacks, a basic first aid kit, map and compass, though I rarely needed the latter two on this particular route. Habit, more than necessity. I stretched, feeling the familiar ache in my muscles from previous hikes, a comfortable stiffness that felt earned. Then, I stepped onto the dirt path, leaving the gravel behind, and started my ascent. The first mile was easy, a gentle incline that warmed me up without taxing me. The sounds of the forest were all around, birdsong, the rustle of unseen critters in the underbrush, the distant murmur of a creek. It was a symphony of nature, a comforting, familiar chorus. I fell into my usual rhythm, breathing deep the clean, earthy scent of the woods, letting my mind clear. I thought about nothing and everything, the quiet hum of life around me a soothing balm. As I gained altitude, the trail became a little steeper, winding its way through stands of tall oaks and maples. The sunlight dappled through the leaves, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was beautiful, tranquil. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. I passed the old, gnarled tree I always mentally noted as a landmark, the one with the strange, face-like burrow on its trunk. Everything was exactly as it should be. It must have been about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, into my hike when I first noticed the change. It wasn't a sudden thing, more like a creeping feeling, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The light began to dim, not because of clouds, but as if the air itself was thickening. I glanced up. The blue sky was still there, but it seemed muted, somehow. Then I saw it. A tendril of white, wispy and ethereal, drifting between the trees downhill from me. Fog. That was odd. It wasn't typically foggy here unless there was a weather front moving in, and the sky was clear. Still, a little fog wasn't a big deal. Mountain weather could be unpredictable. But this fog wasn't just drifting, it was rolling. It moved with an unnatural speed and density, a thick, opaque wall of white that swallowed the trees as it advanced. Within minutes, the forest around me began to disappear. The distant hills vanished. The trail ahead, just moments ago clearly visible, became a blurry, indistinct path leading into the rapidly encroaching light. I stopped, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. This wasn't normal fog. This was like walking into a cloud, but a low-lying, ground-hugging one that was consuming the landscape with alarming speed. I could no longer see the sun, though I knew it was still high above the blanket of white that was now enveloping me. The air grew cold, damp, and unnervingly still. The sounds of the forest died away, muffled and absorbed by the thick mist. The birds stopped singing. The rustling in the leaves ceased. All that was left was the sound of my own breathing, suddenly loud in the oppressive silence. Visibility dropped to mere feet. I held my hand out, and it was barely visible at arm's length. The trees closest to me were reduced to ghostly, indistinct shapes. The trail was gone, just a vague sense of ground beneath my feet. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of my composure. I knew these woods. I shouldn't be this lost, this quickly. But without any visual reference points, the familiar felt alien and terrifying. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to get my bearings. Which way had I come from? Which way was the shelter? Every direction looked identical, a featureless, suffocating white. My heart started to pound, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. This was more than just fog, it felt wrong. Like the world had been wiped clean, leaving only this silent, blinding void. And then I heard it. It was faint at first, barely a whisper carried on the still air. I strained my ears, trying to identify it over the rush of blood in my own head. It sounded familiar. Horrifyingly familiar. My breath hitched. Michael? The sound was unmistakable. It was my voice. My own voice, calling my name. It came from somewhere just ahead, swallowed by the mist. It wasn't an echo. It was too distinct, too close. And it wasn't me. I hadn't spoken a word since the fog rolled in. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Someone else on the trail? Unlikely. I hadn't seen anyone all morning. An echo? The mist seemed to absorb sound, not reflect it. My imagination? Wishful thinking. The voice was clear, crisp, undeniably mine, and it was calling my name. Michael, it called again, a little louder this time, and closer. It sounded curious, slightly questioning, exactly as I would sound if I were searching for someone. A cold dread, unlike anything I had ever experienced, washed over me, chilling me to the bone despite the relative warmth of the day before the fog. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. Who or what was in the mist, using my voice to call me? Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to get out of this unnatural white shroud. But I didn't know which way was out. And the voice, it was ahead of me, deeper into the mist, deeper into the unknown. Was it trying to lure me? And if so, to what? Hello? I managed to call back, my voice hoarse, barely a whisper compared to the chilling clarity of the mimic's call. Silence answered me, thick and heavy. The mist seemed to press in closer, tighter. Then, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't just calling my name. It was a phrase I often muttered to myself when I was concentrating, or slightly annoyed. Something specific, personal. Just a little further now, almost there. That sent a jolt of pure terror through me. That phrase. I said that. Not out loud usually, but in my head, on hikes, pushing through a tough section. How could something else know that? It knew me. Or it was trying to convince me it was me. My legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was stand there, surrounded by the blinding white, listening to the distorted echo of myself calling to me from the void. The silence after the phrase hung in the air, thick with menace. It felt like it was waiting for me, listening for my response, for me to step forward, deeper into its trap. The familiar, comforting woods had vanished, replaced by this horrifying, alien place, and something in it wore my voice like a mask. I was truly, utterly alone, except for the chilling presence that mimicked my very being in the suffocating, silent mist. Just a little further now, almost there, the words hung in the damp, cold air, echoing the private thoughts I'd had countless times on these trails. It wasn't just my voice, it was my inner voice, spoken aloud by something that shouldn't exist. Terror, raw and absolute, finally broke the paralysis that had held me. My body reacted before my mind could process, stumbling backward blindly, away from where the voice had come from. My boots slipped on unseen roots, and I flailed, catching myself against a tree trunk that felt slimy with moisture. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, desperate to escape. I pushed off the tree, trying to orient myself, but it was useless. The mist was a solid, suffocating blanket. Up, down, left, right, it was all the same featureless white. Every sense I relied on in the woods, sight, the feel of the familiar ground, the direction of the sun or wind, was gone. Replaced by this chilling, silent void and the echoing horror of my own voice. Michael? Where are you? The voice called again, closer this time. It sounded worried, searching. Like I would sound if I'd gotten separated from someone. It was a perfect imitation, down to the slight tremor I sometimes got in my voice when I was stressed. It was unbearable. It was designed to pull me in, to make me respond. Panic clawed at my throat. I couldn't stay still. Staying still felt like waiting for it to find me. I had to move. But where? I tried to remember the direction I'd been heading before the fog hit, the approximate path of the trail. I took a tentative step in what I hoped was the right direction, one hand held out in front of me like a blind man. The terrain was uneven, hidden by the fog. My foot caught on something, and I stumbled, barking my shin against a fallen log I hadn't seen. A sharp pain shot up my leg, but the fear was a stronger sensation, dulling everything else. I bit back a cry, not wanting to make any noise, but it was futile. Michael? Did you fall? The voice came again, incredibly close this time, right beside me it seemed. It sounded concerned, helpful. It was a terrifying parody of human interaction. I froze again, every muscle tense. I could feel its presence nearby, just beyond the impenetrable curtain of white. It was mocking me, playing with me. It knew I was scared, alone, and lost. And it was using my own identity against me. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, trying to clear my head, trying to find a shred of logic in this nightmare. Was I dreaming? Had I hit my head? But the cold dampness of the mist on my skin, the aching pain in my shin, the frantic pulse in my ears, it was all too real. I had to get away from that voice. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and started moving again, faster this time, pushing through the dense air, crashing into unseen branches. My breathing was ragged, loud in my own ears. Hey, wait up. You're going the wrong way. The voice called, now sounding slightly annoyed, like someone trying to redirect a lost friend. It was behind me now, or seemed to be. The sound was impossible to place in this disorienting light. I stumbled on, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Was it following me? Or was it just surrounding me, a malevolent presence that could project its mimicry from anywhere within the mist? The thought was worse. The idea that it wasn't a single entity I could potentially escape, but something vast and formless that was the mist itself, or lived within it. I kept moving, crashing through unseen brush, scraping my arms and face. I had no idea where I was going. All sense of direction had completely vanished. I could have been walking in circles, or straight off the side of the mountain for all I knew. The terrain felt unfamiliar now, or maybe it was just the fog making it seem that way. Every twisted tree trunk looked like a lurking shape, every rustle of leaves, if I could even hear them through the thick silence, sounded like a stealthy approach. The voice continued its terrifying performance. It called my name in different tones, sometimes urgent, sometimes calm, sometimes laced with a faint panic. It said fragments of things I might say, little verbal tics, half-finished sentences. It was learning me, or it already knew me in a way that was fundamentally wrong. Just catch your breath, it whispered, startlingly close to my ear. I gasped, spinning around wildly, seeing nothing but white. It sounded like my own breathy panting after exertion, morphed into a chilling suggestion. The psychological torture was immense. I felt like I was being driven mad. Was it real? Was the isolation and the fog playing tricks on my mind? But the voice was too clear, too specific. It knew things. Or it was observing me somehow, absorbing and reflecting my own fear and reactions. My leg ached, my lungs burned, and I was drenched in a cold sweat despite the chill of the mist. I tripped and fell again, landing hard on my hands and knees. A whimper escaped my lips, involuntary. Immediately, the voice was there. "Oh no, are you hurt? Just stay there, I'm coming." It sounded genuinely concerned, the voice of a rescuer. It was the most terrifying sound yet. The idea of it coming from me, using that benevolent tone, was sickening. I scrambled back up, adrenaline surging through me. I couldn't stay. I had to get away. I started to run, blindly, recklessly, crashing through the undergrowth. Branches whipped my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step, but I didn't care. I just needed to put distance between myself and that horrifying imitation. As I ran, the mimicking escalated. It wasn't just single words or phrases anymore. It sounded like a distorted conversation, fragments of my voice layered on top of each other, echoing and overlapping, as if multiple versions of me were talking at once, whispering, cajoling, pleading, threatening. It was a cacophony of self, a horrifying symphony of my own identity being fractured and weaponized against me in the suffocating light. The sound started to become more than just voice. A rustle that mirrored my own movements nearby. A faint, wet slithering sound just beyond the range of hearing, or maybe just below it. And underlying it all, a faint, almost imperceptible hum, low and resonant, that felt like it was vibrating in my very bones. I ran until my legs burned and my chest ached with fiery pain. I had no idea where I was going, or if I was getting any closer to safety or merely plunging deeper into the heart of whatever this was. The mist remained relentlessly thick, the white void stretching endlessly in every direction. I tripped one last time, falling heavily, my head hitting something hard. Black spots danced before my eyes. My vision swam. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the world tilting precariously. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, I heard the voice again. It was right above me now, a low whisper, chillingly intimate. "Found you." It wasn't a question this time. It was a statement. And it didn't sound exactly like my voice anymore. There was something else mixed in, a low growl, a wet clicking sound, just beneath the surface of the human imitation. A hint of the thing that wore my voice. I tried to push myself up, to run again, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The cold permeated everything. The mist pressed in, thick and silent, waiting. And the whispering voice, no longer perfectly human, lingered just inches away in the blinding light, the sound of my own name a death knell in the chilling silence. Found you. The whisper hung in the air directly above me, no longer a perfect replica, but a horrifying blend of my own voice and something else, a low, guttural rumble, a wet, slick sound like something heavy being dragged through mud, and that chilling, soft clicking. It wasn't just wearing my voice anymore, it was letting its own sound bleed through, revealing the true, alien nature beneath the human facade. I lay there, sprawled on the unseen ground, my body numb with pain and exhaustion, but my mind screaming. Every instinct shrieked at me to move, to fight, to flee, but my muscles refused to cooperate. It was as if the terror had paralyzed me, locking me in place for the thing that had hunted me through the mist. The air grew colder, the dampness more profound. I could feel a presence looming over me, a disruption in the oppressive stillness of the fog. I couldn't see it, the light was still too thick, but I felt it. A heavy, suffocating weight, a rawness that settled deep in my chest. Then came another sound. Not my voice this time. It was a sound from the woods, but distorted, stretched into something sickening. The snap of a twig, but it lingered, cracking unnaturally long. The rustle of leaves, but it sounded wet, fleshy, like something sliding. And beneath it all, that persistent, low humming that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but inside my own skull. I managed to lift my head slightly, peering into the light directly in front of me. Nothing. Just the impenetrable fog. But the feeling of being watched, of something vast and hungry positioned right beside me, was overwhelming. Get up, my voice said, but it was a deeper, more resonant version, underscored by that horrible clicking. It wasn't a request, it was a command. It felt like an order given to a pet or prey. I tried to push myself onto my hands and knees, but my left arm buckled under my weight. I twisted something in the fall, or maybe in my frantic scramble through the brush. A sharp pain shot up my arm. I cried out, a strangled sound of pain and fear. A wet chuckle answered me. It was my chuckle, but twisted, full of cold amusement. Doesn't feel good, does it? The mimic whispered, its voice now a sickening mosaic of mine, the clicking and growling more prominent. So weak, so breakable. It wasn't trying to lure me anymore. It had found me. Now it was just observing. Tormenting. It was in no hurry. That was the most terrifying realization. It wasn't a desperate animal or a lost person. It was something patient, something that enjoyed the fear, that savored the moment. I heard a shifting sound in the mist beside me, a heavy, dragging movement that seemed to defy the lack of solid ground. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, or flowing. The air around me grew colder, the scent of damp earth replaced by something metallic and faintly sweet, like old, stagnant water. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to make it disappear. But the sounds didn't stop. The distorted rustling, the elongated twig snaps, the low hum vibrating in my bones, and the voice, my voice, speaking words I'd never say, filled with a chilling, unnatural malice. All alone out here, aren't you, Michael? It purred, the sound a horrifying echo of my own voice. No one knows where you are. No one is coming. Despair washed over me, thick and suffocating as the mist itself. It was true. I hadn't told anyone exactly which trail I was taking today, just that I was going hiking near Abingdon Gap. No one would know to look for me here, not in this impossible fog. I heard the dragging sound again, closer this time. It felt like it was circling me, a slow, deliberate movement. I forced my eyes open again, scanning the featureless white. Nothing. Yet the presence was overwhelming, right on top of me. And then I saw it. Or felt it. Just inches from my face, the whiteness seemed to churn, to deepen. Not into blackness, but into a more profound, unsettling white, like staring into pure static. And within that churning white, I saw a shape. Not a clear shape, not defined. It was fluid, shifting, like dense smoke or liquid light. It had no limbs, no head, but I could sense its orientation, its focus on me. And in the center of that swirling, formless mass, I saw eyes. Not eyes like mine. They were multifaceted, like an insect's, but vast and milky white, reflecting nothing, seeing everything. And they were looking at me. Directly at me. A silent scream tore through me. My body finally surged with a desperate, animalistic strength. I pushed myself up, ignoring the searing pain in my arm and leg, and lunged away from the swirling white mass, away from the feeling of those impossible eyes on me. I didn't care where I was going, just away. I stumbled through the mist, blind and panicked. The dragging sound was behind me, picking up speed. The clicking intensified, a rapid, chittering noise now layered beneath the distorted imitation of my voice. "Don't go!" "We just wanted to play," the mimic shrieked, a sound that was utterly alien now, only a faint echo of my voice clinging to the edges. I ran harder, fueled by pure terror. I tripped and fell countless times, scraping my hands raw, tearing my clothes. Branches whipped my face, leaving stinging cuts. But I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs felt like they would explode, until my legs burned with fire, until my vision was blurred with tears and exhaustion. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the mist began to thin. It happened rapidly. The oppressive white began to dissipate, revealing the blurry outlines of trees, then sharper forms, then the familiar greens and browns of the forest floor. The air lost its unnatural chill and dampness. The sounds of the woods slowly returned, a distant bird call, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. The low hum faded. The clicking and dragging sounds vanished. I stumbled out of the receding mist, crashing onto solid ground that felt blessedly real. I fell to my hands and knees, gasping, sucking in lungfuls of clean, cold air. I looked back. The mist was retreating, rolling back uphill with impossible speed, condensing into a dense, white wall that seemed to shrink and disappear as I watched, swallowed by the clear blue sky that was somehow back overhead. I was soaked, shivering, covered in mud and scratches. My leg throbbed, my arm ached, and my head pounded where I'd hit it. But I was out. I was alive. I lay there for a long time, trembling, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, letting the reality of my surroundings sink in. I was on a part of the trail I didn't recognize, lower down the mountain than I had been. I was disoriented, but the world was visible again. Eventually, I managed to push myself up. I was bruised, battered, and emotionally shattered. I limped my way downhill, following the faint path, until I finally reached a more familiar section of the trail. Hours later, covered in dirt and grime, I stumbled back into the trailhead parking lot. My car was still there, looking impossibly mundane. I never told anyone the full story. How could I? Explain the mist that swallowed the world, the voice that stole my identity, the swirling white thing with the insect eyes? They think I was crazy. I don't hike in those woods anymore. I can't. Every time I hear my own voice echo, even in an empty room, a cold dread washes over me. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I think I can still hear, just on the edge of hearing, a low, wet clicking sound, followed by a whisper that sounds just like me. Found you. I know it's still out there, waiting in the quiet places, waiting in the fog. And I know it remembers my voice. They say you choose where you live, that you make conscious decisions about your surroundings, your neighbors, the rhythm of your daily life. Maybe that's true for some. But for us, for me and my wife Sarah, and our 2 dogs, Buster and Daisy, it felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. We live out here, miles from anyone. Not just a little bit out, but truly out. The nearest town is a 30-minute drive down a winding, poorly maintained county road. Our closest neighbor? An elderly couple running a dairy farm almost 5 miles away as the crow flies, though you'd need a truck and a good hour to get to their driveway. Our property is 50 acres, mostly fields and marshland. To the north and west, endless rows of corn stretch to the horizon, a verdant, rustling sea in the summer, a skeletal, whispering graveyard in the fall and winter. To the south and east, the marsh spreads out, a tangle of reeds, murky water, and stunted trees, home to countless insects, birds, and the occasional deer or coyote. The air out here has its own smell, damp earth, drying corn stalks, the faint metallic tang of iron-rich water. It's quiet, profoundly quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear the blood pulsing in your own ears. The nights are dark, darker than anything you can imagine living near even a small town. The stars out here are like spilled diamond dust on black velvet, overwhelming in their number and brilliance, a constant reminder of the vast, indifferent universe outside our small bubble of lamplight. People sometimes ask why we live here. Why isolate ourselves so completely? There are reasons, practical ones mostly. We both work from home, freelancers who can set our own hours. The cost of land was significantly lower than anywhere closer to civilization. We crave the peace, the solitude, the escape from the constant noise and demands of urban life. We thought it would be idyllic. And for a while, it was. The first few months were a blur of settling in, unpacking, exploring the property, reveling in the silence and the space. The dogs loved it, running free in the fields, chasing rabbits, never catching them, thankfully, their barks echoing across the flat landscape. Buster is a big, shaggy mutt, part German shepherd, part something else, fiercely loyal and protective. Daisy is a smaller, wirier terrier mix, nervous by nature but with a surprisingly deep, resonant bark when something genuinely alarms her. They are our companions, our furry family, and our unofficial alarm system. They bark at deer browse too close to the house, at the mailman rattling down the driveway, at the distant sound of a tractor in a neighboring field. Their barks are part of the soundtrack of our lives out here. Which is why what happened last night was so unsettling. It was late, around midnight. We had been watching a movie, the kind of forgettable action flick that doesn't require much thought. Sarah had already gone up to bed, and I was just about to follow, pausing to let the dogs out for their final run before locking up. I unlatched the back door, the heavy wooden door that leads out onto the small porch facing the cornfield. Buster and Daisy usually shoot out like rockets, eager to patrol their territory, to sniff every blade of grass, to leave their mark. But tonight, they didn't move. They stood side by side, just inside the doorway, absolutely rigid. Their bodies were taut, muscles coiled like springs. Their hackles were fully raised, a thick ridge of fur standing up along their spines from neck to tail. It was a posture I'd seen before, but only when they were confronted with something truly intimidating, a coyote much larger than them, or once, a badger that had wandered into the yard. Their heads were turned, their gazes fixed, absolutely locked on something out in the darkness, towards the edge of the cornfield. I followed their line of sight, peering into the blackness. There was nothing I could see. The moon was a sliver behind patchy clouds, offering little light. The faint glow from the owls cast a weak pool of light onto the porch and a few feet beyond, but the cornfield beyond them was just a solid wall of black. The air was still, not even the usual whisper of wind through the corn stalks. "What is it, guys?" I murmured, taking a step closer to them. They didn't react. Didn't turn their heads, didn't wag their tails, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. It was like they were carved from stone, living statues of pure, focused fear. And then came the growling. Not the usual excited bark or the playful growl of dogs roughhousing. This was different. This was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate up from deep within their chests. It was a sound of pure menace, of ancient, instinctual warning. And it wasn't loud. It was barely audible, almost a whisper, but it filled the quiet night with a chilling intensity. The terrifying thing was that they were both doing it, in perfect, horrifying synchronicity. Buster's deep rumble intertwined with Daisy's slightly higher-pitched but equally menacing snarl. And they stayed like that. For almost an hour. I tried everything to break them out of it. I called their names, gently at first, then with increasing urgency. I knelt down, trying to meet their eyes, trying to touch them. But they flinched away, their bodies recoiling slightly as if my touch was an electric shock. Their eyes remained fixed on the cornfield's edge, wide and unblinking in the faint light spilling from the door. I got a flashlight from the kitchen, a powerful LED beam. I shone it out towards the cornfield, sweeping it back and forth along the tree line that marked its boundary. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the first few rows of corn stalks, the tangled weeds and brush at the field's edge. Nothing. No eyes reflecting back, no movement, nothing that could explain the dog's terror. The light seemed to just get swallowed up by the vastness of the dark field. The silence from the dogs was the worst part. After those initial low growls, they fell completely silent. But their bodies remained locked, their eyes fixed, their hackles still high. They just stared. Stared into the impenetrable blackness at the edge of the field, seeing something I couldn't, something that held them utterly captive in a state of frozen terror. I closed the door, leaving them standing there, still and silent. I didn't want to leave them exposed on the porch, but I also didn't want to force them inside when they were clearly so distressed by something outside. I watched them through the small window beside the door. They didn't move. Time stretched and warped. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, slowly, painstakingly, their posture began to relax. The growls, which had returned at some point without me even noticing, faded away. Their hackles gradually lowered. Their bodies lost some of their rigid tension. Finally, Buster let out a shaky sigh, a sound that was more human than dog. Daisy whined softly, a sound of exhaustion and lingering fear. They turned, finally, and looked at me. Their eyes were wide, still holding a residual fear, but the intense, terrifying focus was gone. They looked disoriented, as if they were waking from a nightmare. They slowly padded back inside, casting one last, nervous glance over their shoulders at the dark cornfield before collapsing onto their beds, panting softly. I locked the door, bolted it. I checked all the other doors and windows in the house. I went upstairs and stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the dark landscape. The cornfield was just a darker shadow against the slightly less dark sky. The silence had returned, but it felt different now. It felt heavy, watchful. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside, every distant sound that the wind carried seemed amplified, twisted into something menacing. I kept seeing the dog's eyes in my mind, fixed and terrified. I kept hearing that low, silent growl. What could have held two dogs, usually so eager to chase anything that moves, utterly frozen and silent with fear for an hour? What was out there, at the edge of the cornfield, in the deep Wisconsin night? The quiet isolation that we had craved suddenly felt less like peace and more like exposure. We were miles from anyone. And something, out in the dark, knew we were here. That was last night. The feeling hasn't left me. The dogs are quiet today, subdued. They don't want to go near the back door. And the cornfield, it just looks different now. More ominous. Like it's hiding something. Waiting. The morning after was thick with an unease that clung to everything, a physical weight in the air. The bright sunlight streaming through the windows did little to dispel the shadows that the night had cast. Sarah noticed it immediately. She's attuned to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere of our home, particularly when it comes to the dogs. They're quiet, she said, observing Buster and Daisy curled up tightly on their beds, not greeting us with their usual morning enthusiasm. They barely lifted their heads when we came downstairs. Their eyes were still wide and a little jumpy, darting towards the back door every time the old house creaked or the wind sighed through the eaves. I tried to brush it off. Just tired, maybe. Or they saw a coyote last night. It sounded weak even to my own ears. A coyote would have elicited frantic barking, a desperate desire to defend their territory, not that silent, frozen dread. An hour, Alex? Sarah said, her voice soft but laced with concern. Frozen solid for an hour? That's not just a coyote. She knows the dogs as well as I do. She saw the same unsettling rigidity, the same unwavering stare out the window before she went up to bed. We spent the morning trying to return to a semblance of normalcy, but the feeling of being watched was pervasive. Every time I looked out the back window towards the cornfield, my eyes lingered on the edge, scanning the tangled brush and the first few rows of stalks, half expecting to see something lurking there. The corn, which had always seemed benign, now felt like a curtain, hiding something malevolent just out of sight. The dogs refused to go out the back door. Absolutely refused. When I opened it and gently encouraged them, they recoiled as if struck, whining and retreating towards the living room. They eventually agreed to go out the front door, but even then, they stayed close to the house, their noses constantly scanning the air, their ears swiveling nervously towards the north and west, towards the cornfield. Their usual playful energy was gone, replaced by a skittish vigilance. I tried to rationalize it throughout the day. Maybe it was an animal I hadn't considered. A bear? Unlikely in this part of Wisconsin, but not impossible. A pack of wolves? Even less likely. Or maybe something else had spooked them. A strong, unusual scent carried on the wind? A low-frequency sound I couldn't hear but that dogs could? I ran through every logical explanation I could think of, but none of them fit the sheer, unadulterated terror I had seen in their eyes, the way they had locked onto something invisible to me. As the day wore on and the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the fields. The unease intensified. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the drying corn stalks. The sound, which usually felt like the quiet breathing of the countryside, now sounded like hushed whispers, secrets being exchanged just out of earshot. That evening, we decided to forego the movie. Neither of us felt like sitting in the dark, pretending everything was normal. We stayed in the kitchen, the warmest, brightest room, keeping the lights on throughout the house. The dogs lay on their beds in the living room, but they weren't sleeping. Their heads were up, their eyes occasionally flickering towards the back door, their bodies tensed. Around dusk, as the last light bled from the sky, I was making coffee when I heard it. A sound. It wasn't loud. Not at first. It was a kind of clicking. Faint, irregular, coming from outside, somewhere near the edge of the property, in the direction of the cornfield. Click, 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 click. It was a dry, mechanical sound, utterly alien in the natural symphony of the countryside. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't sound like the wind or the owls settling. It sounded deliberate. I froze, straining to hear it over the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah stopped what she was doing, her eyes meeting mine. The dogs, in the other room, had gone rigid again, their ears pricked forward. The clicking stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. I nodded, my throat tight. What was that? We listened, holding our breath. A minute passed. 2 minutes. Nothing. Just the normal night sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets. Had I imagined it? Had the wind carried some strange noise from miles away? Then it started again. Closer this time. Click, 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 click. It seemed to be moving. Slowly. Skirting the edge of the field. It wasn't rhythmic like footsteps, more erratic, like something with too many joints moving awkwardly over rough ground. My heart started to pound against my ribs. I walked quietly to the back door, peering through the small window again. Still nothing visible in the darkness. The moonlight was a little stronger tonight, but the cornfield was a vast, black void beyond the porch light. The clicking continued for several minutes, seeming to move back and forth along the tree line, never quite getting closer to the house, but never moving away either. It was like whatever was making the sound was patrolling, or searching. The dogs started to whine low in their throats, a mournful, terrified sound. They didn't growl this time, just whined, their bodies trembling slightly. And then came a different sound. A rustling. Louder than the wind through the corn stalks. A heavy, dragging sound, like something large was pushing its way through the dry, brittle leaves. It came from the edge of the field, closer to the marshy area this time. My blood ran cold. That wasn't wind. That was movement. Significant movement. And it was coming from the place where the dogs had been staring last night. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What was out there? What kind of animal made a clicking sound and moved with such heavy, rustling movements? None that I knew of. None that belonged out here. We stayed up late, the lights blazing, the silence outside punctuated by the occasional, horrifyingly distinct click or rustle from the darkness. Every shadow seemed to lengthen and writhe. Every distant sound seemed to carry a hint of menace. We felt exposed, vulnerable. Our isolation, which had once felt like a shield, now felt like a cage, trapping us out here with something. We didn't see anything, not clearly. A few times, I thought I saw movement at the very edge of the porch light's reach, a flicker of shadow, a shift in the darkness that wasn't quite right. But I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, my imagination running wild in the grips of fear. The dogs remained distressed all night. They wouldn't settle, pacing nervously, whining softly, their eyes constantly on the back door. They wouldn't even go into the living room after a while, preferring to stay close to us in the kitchen. Sleep was fitful, filled with nightmares I couldn't quite remember upon waking, but that left me with a lingering sense of dread. The first light of dawn was a relief, pushing back the oppressive darkness, quieting the sounds that had haunted the night. But the unease remained. The cornfield was still there, stretching out, silent and passive in the morning light. But I knew now that it wasn't empty. Something was in there, or had been in there. Something that scared my dogs more than anything I had ever seen. Something that made strange clicking sounds and dragged itself through the undergrowth. And the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger. As I made my morning coffee, looking out at the field, I had the distinct, horrifying sensation that I was being observed. Not by a person. By something else. Something ancient and patient. Something that knew we were here. And it wasn't in a hurry. It was just waiting. Waiting in the rustling silence of the corn. The second night was worse than the first. The first night had been a shock, a sudden disruption of our quiet routine. The second was a grinding descent into terror, a confirmation that the unease wasn't just in our heads, and that whatever was out there wasn't going away. The clicking sound started earlier that evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges that felt less like beauty and more like a warning. This time, they weren't confined to the edge of the field. They were closer. Much closer. They seemed to emanate from the line of scrub and trees that ran along the western edge of our property, parallel to the cornfield. Click, 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 click. It was louder now, sharper, more distinct. It sounded like bone on stone, or like 1,000 tiny, dry insects scuttling over dead leaves, amplified to an unnatural degree. It moved back and forth, sometimes stopping for long periods, leaving us straining in the silence, our nerves stretched taut. The dogs were beside themselves. They didn't just whine now, they paced, panting, their eyes wide and rolling. They kept their distance from the back door, huddled together in the center of the living room, trembling. Their fear was a palpable thing, filling the air like a cold draft. If they had been our alarm system before, they were now our terror meter, confirming every chilling sound, every shadow, was real and terrifying. We tried to distract ourselves, to pretend we weren't listening, weren't waiting. We turned the TV on, loud, but the sounds from outside seemed to cut right through the noise. We talked, but our voices sounded strained, too loud in the unnatural quiet of the house itself. We were both listening, always listening. Then came the smell. Around 10 o'clock, a new element was added to the night's horrors. A scent drifted in through the closed windows, somehow penetrating the seals. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew stronger, heavier, sickly sweet and foul at the same time. It smelled like decay, like something long dead but not quite gone, mingled with something sharp and metallic, like old blood. It was the smell of the marsh, perhaps, on a particularly heavy wind. But it was stronger, more concentrated, and carried a distinct undertone of something fundamentally wrong. The dogs gagged, whining and pawing at their noses. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, her face pale. The smell was cloying, filling our lungs, making our stomachs churn. It felt ancient, primal, like a smell that should not exist in the modern world. The clicking continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, accompanied now by that nauseating stench. We huddled together on the couch, the lights on, the TV volume high, but feeling utterly exposed. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every corner of the house felt less safe. The isolation we had sought felt like a trap. We were miles from help, miles from anyone who would hear us, even if we screamed. Then, the sound stopped. Completely. The clicking, the rustling, the oppressive silence outside, it all vanished. The sudden absence of sound was almost as terrifying as the sounds themselves. It felt like whatever was out there had stopped moving, had settled down, was just waiting. Watching. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The silence pressed in on us, heavy and absolute. The only sounds were our own ragged breathing and the faint whines of the terrified dogs. And then I heard it. A new sound. Not from the edge of the field this time. It was from the porch. Scraping. Soft, rhythmic scraping against the wood. Like fingernails on a blackboard, but muffled. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Slow. Deliberate. Moving towards the back door. My blood ran cold. Sarah's hand shot out, gripping my arm with bruising strength. The dogs froze, their heads snapping towards the back door, their bodies rigid, their eyes white with a pure, unadulterated terror that mirrored my own. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My eyes were fixed on the back door, on the small window beside it, on the thin gap beneath it. Was something trying to get in? The scraping stopped directly in front of the door. And then, silence. A different silence now. Not the vast, waiting silence of the fields, but a close, suffocating silence, heavy with presence. It felt like something was standing just outside the door, inches away. Breathing? I couldn't tell. The sickening sweet and metallic smell was stronger now, filling the kitchen. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, frozen in place, listening to the pounding of our own hearts. The dogs remained rigid, silent, their gazes locked on the door. Then, a soft thump. Like something soft hitting the wood. Followed by another. And another. Thump, thump, thump. It was slower now, more deliberate. And it was slightly higher up on the door. My eyes darted to the small window. The glass was dark, reflective, showing only the distorted image of the kitchen behind me. But as I stared, I thought I saw it. A faint distortion in the reflection. Something shifting in the darkness just beyond the glass. The thumping continued, moving slowly across the door. It wasn't like knocking. It was softer, heavier. And then a new sound. A wet, sticky sound. Like something adhering to the wood. Squish, squish. Moving across the door, slowly, deliberately. My mind reeled. What was happening? What was out there? The squishing sound moved towards the window, and for a horrifying moment, I thought I saw it in the reflection, a dark, glistening shape pressed against the glass, blocking out the faint light from inside. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, a trick of the light, a product of my terrified imagination. I prayed it was a trick of the light. The scraping, thumping, and squishing sounds continued intermittently for the rest of the night, sometimes on the door, sometimes on the walls near the door, sometimes lower down, near the ground. It never seemed to try the handle, never tried to force its way in. It just made noise. Scraped, thumped, squished. like it was exploring the surface of the house. Or perhaps, like it was leaving something behind. We didn't sleep at all. We just sat, bathed in the harsh electric light, listening, our bodies aching with tension, our minds racing with unspeakable possibilities. The dogs never relaxed, never moved from their rigid stance, their eyes wide and fixed on the back door. As dawn approached, the sounds finally faded away. The oppressive silence returned, but it offered no relief. The first rays of sunlight creeping through the windows didn't feel welcoming. They felt intrusive, exposing us to whatever horrors the night had brought to our doorstep. When it was fully light, I finally forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead. I walked slowly towards the back door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sarah followed close behind, her face etched with fear. The dogs remained huddled in the living room, watching us with wide, fearful eyes. I approached the door, hesitant. The air still carried a faint, lingering trace of that foul, sweet smell. I looked at the door, scanning its surface. There was nothing visible. No marks, no scratches, no residue from the scraping or squishing sounds. The wood looked exactly as it had before. But I knew. We both knew. The sounds had been real. The smell had been real. The terror had been real. I looked out the window beside the door. The cornfield stretched out, silent and green in the morning light. It looked peaceful, innocuous. But I knew what it held. I knew what lurked at its edges. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. It felt like the air itself was observing us, waiting. We still live here. We have to. We can't just leave. Where would we go? And even if we could leave the house, could we leave the feeling behind? The knowledge of what's out there. The dogs still won't go out the back door. They stay close to us, jumpy at every sound. And every night, as the sun sets and the darkness creeps in, we start listening. Listening for the clicking. Listening for the rustling. Listening for the scraping, thumping, squishing sounds that come from the darkness just outside our door. We never see anything. Not clearly. But we know it's there. Waiting. Patrolling the edges of our isolated world. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is silent and the stars are brilliant and cold outside, I think I hear something else. A faint whisper carried on the wind from the cornfield. It sounds almost like laughter. And it's the most terrifying sound of all. My grandpa's farm had always been a place of strange comfort for me. Not the cozy, warm kind of comfort, but the kind that comes from deep familiarity with a place that feels both ancient and unchanging. Nestled deep in the rural sprawl, miles from the nearest town, it was a patchwork of overgrown fields, whispering woods, and dilapidated outbuildings that sagged under the weight of time. The air here always smelled of damp earth, forgotten hay, and something else, something old and silent. Growing up, summer visits were filled with exploring dusty barns, wading through the creek, and listening to Grandpa spin tales, some funny, some melancholic, none explicitly scary, but tinged with the quiet acceptance of the land's own peculiar nature. After Grandpa passed, the farm lay dormant for a few years. My family wasn't quite sure what to do with it. The house, a sturdy but weary structure, stood empty, windows like vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching wild. The fields became a tangled mess of weeds and volunteer saplings. It was a place frozen in time, a monument to a life lived simply, closely tied to the soil. Then, one scorching summer, my friend Mark suggested we go camping. Mark was always up for an adventure, a city kid with a romanticized notion of the countryside. He'd heard my stories about the farm, the sheer isolation, the starry skies you could only see away from city lights, and he was eager for a taste of it. My initial reaction was hesitant. Camping on the farm? It felt exposed. Different from pitching a tent in a designated campground. Here, there were no other campers, no ranger station, just us and miles of quiet land. But Mark was persistent, and eventually, I relented. It might be good, I reasoned, to spend some time out there, connect with the place again, maybe even start thinking about what to do with it long term. We packed his beat-up truck with camping gear, enough food for a few days, and a cooler full of drinks. The drive out was long, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then eventually just tire tracks winding through tall grass. As we pulled up to the old farmhouse, a silence settled over us. It wasn't just the absence of traffic noise, it was a deeper, more profound quiet. The kind that makes the buzzing of flies sound like a roar and the rustle of leaves like a shouted conversation. We decided to set up our tents in the clearing behind the main house, not too far from the old barn. The barn itself was a skeletal structure, its roof partially caved in, its wooden sides weathered to a silvery gray. It smelled faintly of old wood smoke and something else, something earthy and slightly metallic. We pitched our tents, two small domes of nylon and poles, suddenly feeling very small against the vastness of the surrounding land. The first evening was pleasant enough. We built a small campfire, grilled some sausages, and watched as the sky turned from a brilliant orange and pink to a deep, inky black, dotted with a million stars. We talked about everything and nothing, the easy banter of longtime friends. Mark was buzzing with the novelty of it all, pointing out constellations, listening intently to the sounds of the night, crickets chirping, owls hooting in the distance. As the fire died down, we crawled into our respective tents. The night air was cool and still. Lying in the darkness, the sounds of the wilderness seemed to amplify. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, felt close, immediate. It was a different kind of quiet than the one during the day. This one was alive, teeming with unseen activity. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it. A sound that was distinct from the natural symphony of the night. It was a thud. A heavy, deliberate sound, like something large striking the ground. It came from outside Mark's tent, which was only about 20 feet from mine. I froze, listening. Was it an animal? Maybe a deer? Or one of the few stray cattle that sometimes wandered onto the property from a neighboring farm? I held my breath, waiting. Then I heard it again. Thud. This time, closer to Mark's tent. My heart started to beat a little faster. I could hear Mark shifting inside his tent. Another thud. And another. They were slow, evenly spaced. A walking sound. Thud, thud, thud. It was circling. Whatever it was walking slowly, deliberately, around Mark's tent. I strained my ears, trying to identify the sound. It wasn't the light patter of a small animal, or the frantic scurrying of rodents. It was heavy, weighty. Like something with substantial mass was moving on the soft earth. I whispered, "Mark, you hear that?" There was a pause, then his voice came back, tight with fear. "Yeah. What is that?" "I don't know. Maybe a cow," I suggested, trying to sound calm, trying to convince myself more than him. "No," he said immediately, his voice a low rasp. "That's not a cow. Not the way it sounds. Thud, thud, thud. The sound continued its slow, measured circuit. It seemed to pause between steps, as if whatever was making the noise was listening, contemplating its next move. It wasn't the mindless meandering of a grazing animal. It was intentional. Mark's breathing was loud and ragged in the quiet night. I could hear the rustle of his sleeping bag as he shifted, probably trying to peer out through the mesh window of his tent. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity. Slow, heavy footsteps circling, always around Mark's tent. Never coming towards mine, always focused on his. It was unnerving. My initial attempts to rationalize it as a stray cow or another large animal began to feel flimsy, inadequate. There was a quality to the sound that didn't fit. A weight, a rhythm, thoughtfulness. Mark was clearly terrified. I could hear him whimpering softly at one point. I wanted to tell him to just ignore it, that it was probably nothing, but the sounds themselves were too persistent, too wrong. Thud, thud, thud. The circling continued, an unseen presence pacing just outside the thin fabric of his tent. The darkness pressed in around us, thick and absolute. The sounds of the natural world seemed to have faded into the background, replaced by this single, unsettling rhythm. It went on like that for hours, or so it seemed. The slow, heavy steps, always circling Mark's tent. I lay in my own tent, heart pounding, listening, unable to move, unable to call out again. The sheer persistence of it, the deliberate nature of the steps, was what got to me. It wasn't just wandering, it was observing. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken over, or maybe the sounds finally stopped, I'm not sure which. I drifted into a fitful sleep, punctuated by unsettling dreams of heavy footsteps and unseen watchers in the dark. But the image of Mark, alone in his tent, with those slow, deliberate steps circling him, was burned into my mind. And the sound, that distinct, heavy, thoughtful thud. I knew, deep down, that Mark was right. It wasn't just a cow. Something else had been out there in the dark with us that night. Something that walked with purpose. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy and unrest. The sun was already high, filtering through the trees and warming the tent fabric. The air felt still and peaceful, a stark contrast to the previous night's dread. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that the sounds had been a dream, a figment of an overtired mind in an unfamiliar, isolated place. I unzipped my tent and crawled out. The clearing looked normal, the campfire pit, the trees, the distant outline of the sagging barn. Mark's tent stood silent next to mine. Mark? I called out softly. His tent rustled, and he slowly emerged, looking pale and drawn. His eyes were wide, with dark circles beneath them, and his usually cheerful face was etched with exhaustion and something akin to genuine fear. "Hey," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Rough night?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He just nodded, wrapping his arms around himself despite the morning warmth. You heard it too, right?" "Yeah, I heard something," I admitted. "Sounded heavy. Like an animal." "It wasn't an animal," he insisted, his voice gaining a fragile intensity. "Not like anything I know. Cows don't walk like that. Bears don't walk like that. It was measured. Like it was thinking about each step." He shuddered, and I could see the fear was still very much with him, not dispelled by the morning light. It walked around my tent, just circled, for hours. Slow. Deliberate. I could feel the ground vibrate a little with each step. It would stop sometimes, right next to the tent wall, and I swore I could feel like it was listening. Just standing there, listening. His description sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Lying in my own tent, I had only heard the sounds. Mark had been right there, inches away from whatever it was, feeling its presence. Did you see anything?" I asked, hesitantly. He shook his head vehemently. "No. I was too scared to look, mostly. And the tent's mesh is pretty small. But even if I had looked, it was too dark. Just shapes and shadows." We made breakfast in a strained silence. The beauty of the morning, the birds singing, the gentle breeze, felt disconnected from the heavy atmosphere that hung between us. Mark was clearly shaken. He barely ate, his eyes constantly scanning the treeline, the edges of the clearing. I tried to offer rational explanations again. "Maybe it was just a very large cow, Mark. Some of Grandpa's old neighbors used to let their cattle roam pretty wide. Or a deer, maybe, but a big one." He shook his head stubbornly. "You didn't hear it from inside the tent. It was the sound. Not hoofbeats. Not the clumsy stumbling of a cow. It was footfalls. Like heavy boots on soft earth. And the rhythm, it was too steady. Too human-like in its intention, if that makes sense. But heavy. So heavy." His conviction was unsettling. Mark wasn't one to easily spook. He was usually the pragmatic one, the one who laughed off ghost stories. Seeing him this genuinely terrified, this certain of something unnatural, chipped away at my own skepticism. The day felt long and tense. We tried to go for a walk towards the creek, but Mark was jumpy, flinching at every snap of a twig. We cut the walk short and returned to the clearing. The farm, which had always felt like a place of quiet solitude, now felt exposed, vulnerable. Every rustle of leaves sounded suspicious. The distant woods seemed darker, more foreboding. That evening, as dusk began to settle, the anxiety returned. Mark was visibly nervous, constantly glancing towards the barn and the edge of the woods. We built a larger fire than the night before, as if the flames could somehow ward off whatever lurked in the darkness. As the light faded, the familiar symphony of the night began, the crickets, the owls. But tonight, those sounds felt different. They felt like a thin veil over a deeper, more ominous silence. We sat by the fire, talking in hushed tones. Mark recounted his experience from the night before, adding details I hadn't heard. He described the feeling of being utterly alone, enclosed in a thin fabric shell, while something large and unseen circled patiently outside. He talked about the moments when the sound stopped, and the silence felt even more terrifying than the walking, because he knew it was still there, just standing, waiting. As the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows, we heard it again. Thud, thud, thud. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Coming from the direction of the barn this time. We both froze. The conversation died in our throats. The sounds were further away than they had been the previous night, but they were unmistakable. That same heavy weight, that same measured pace. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't circling a tent tonight. It seemed to be moving slowly through the clearing, towards the edge of the woods near where our tents were pitched. Mark's eyes were wide with terror. "It's back," he whispered, the sound barely audible. My heart hammered against my ribs. Hearing it again, knowing how terrified Mark had been, removed any lingering doubt I had tried to cling to. This wasn't just a random animal wandering by. There was a pattern, a presence. The sounds continued their slow approach. Thud, thud, thud. Each step felt like a hammer blow against a fragile piece of the night. We stared out into the darkness beyond the firelight, seeing nothing but shadows and the occasional glint of something unidentifiable in the distance. The sound stopped. Complete, unnerving silence fell over the clearing. The crickets seemed to quiet down. The owls were silent. It was as if the entire world held its breath. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Where was it? Was it close? Was it watching us? We waited, tense, straining to hear anything over the pounding of our own blood in our ears. The fire felt suddenly small, inadequate. Then, closer this time, right at the edge of the firelight, we heard a sound that wasn't a thud. It was a soft, wet snuffling sound. Like a large animal sniffing the air, just beyond the reach of the fire. Mark let out a strangled gasp. He scrambled backward away from the fire, bumping into his chair. The snuffling sound continued for a few seconds, then stopped. Silence again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. A watchful silence. We sat there by the fire, two figures huddled in the light, while something unseen and unknown stood just beyond the edge of our vision, silent, perhaps listening, perhaps simply being. The feeling of being observed was palpable, a chilling certainty that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. The isolation of the farm, which I had once found comforting, now felt like a cage, trapping us with whatever this was. Sleep felt impossible. The night stretched ahead, long and dark, filled with the unseen presence of the thing that walked with slow, heavy, deliberate steps in my grandpa's quiet, lonely fields. The rest of the night was an agonizing vigil. After the snuffling sound near the fire, the heavy footsteps didn't immediately return, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than any noise could have been. We sat by the fire, adding logs whenever it threatened to die down, our eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the circle of light. Every distant sound, the creak of a tree, the distant call of an animal, made us jump. Sleep was impossible. We talked in hushed whispers, sharing our fear, our helplessness. Mark kept repeating, it was right there. Right outside the light. His voice was barely a whisper, raw with fear and exhaustion. As the hours crawled by, the terror slowly gave way to a bone-deep weariness. We were physically and emotionally drained. Around dawn, as the first hint of gray appeared on the horizon, the rigid tension began to ease slightly. The sounds of the morning birds starting to stir felt like a fragile return to normalcy. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The shadows receded, revealing the familiar landscape of the clearing, the barn, the surrounding trees. The sense of immediate danger dissipated under the warm light. We were both stiff and sore from sitting up all night. Our faces were pale, our eyes bloodshot. The first thing we did, almost in unison, was walk towards Mark's tent. The place where the circling had happened on the first night, the focus of so much dread. As we approached, we started looking at the ground around his tent. The earth here was soft, damp in places from the morning dew. Perfect for holding tracks. And there they were. Hoof prints. Large, unmistakable hoof prints, pressed into the soft earth in a clear, defined path. They circled the area where Mark's tent had been pitched, just as he had described the sound circling. There were lots of them, some overlapping, indicating that whatever made them had spent a significant amount of time pacing around that spot. They were large prints, definitely belonging to cattle. "See?" I said, pointing. "Cow tracks." I told you it was probably just a stray cow from the neighbor's farm. Relief, real and tangible, washed over me. It was a rational explanation. The simplest answer. It made sense. The heavy thudding sound could be explained by the weight of a large animal. The circling? Cows are curious. They wander. Problem solved. We had just scared ourselves in the dark. Mark looked at the tracks, his brow furrowed. He crouched down, running a finger along the edge of one of the prints. Yeah, he said slowly, his voice lacking any trace of relief. Yeah, those are cow tracks. He stood up and looked not at the tracks, but back towards the barn, then towards the edge of the woods. His expression was one of deep unease, not acceptance. But that's not what I heard, he stated, his voice quiet but firm. My relief faltered. What do you mean? The tracks are right here, exactly where you heard the sounds. It was a cow, Mark. The tracks are here, yeah, he conceded. But the sound was different. It wasn't the clacking of hooves, or the shuffling sound cows make when they walk. It was a thud. A heavy, dull thud. And it wasn't clumsy. It was precise. Every step was the same weight, the same rhythm. And it stopped. It just stopped sometimes, dead still, for long periods. Cows don't do that when they're just walking around. He looked back at the tracks, then at me. Look, I know what I heard. And I know what a cow sounds like walking. This was different. It was heavier, slower, and it felt deliberate. Like something walking on 2 feet, but with immense weight. And quiet. Apart from the thudding, there was no other sound. No snorting, no chewing, no lowing. Just the steps. His insistence was unnerving. I looked at the tracks again, then tried to recall the sound I had heard from my own tent. It had been a heavy thud. And yes, it had seemed slow, methodical. Was it just my mind, influenced by Mark's fear, interpreting it differently? Or had the sound he heard, right outside his tent, been distinct from what I perceived from a distance? And last night? I prompted, remembering the sounds by the fire. The snuffling? I don't know, he admitted, visibly shuddering again. That felt closer. Like something big sniffing the air. Could have been the same thing. Or something else. We spent the morning packing up our gear in a tense silence. The presence of the cow tracks felt like a gaslighting trick by the universe. Here was the logical explanation, laid out plain in the dirt. Yet, it failed to erase the chilling memory of the sounds, the feeling of being watched, the sheer terror in Mark's voice. We didn't talk much on the drive back. The city lights, when we finally saw them, felt both jarring and strangely comforting. A reminder of a world where things made sense, where footsteps were made by people, and animal sounds were just animal sounds. But the farm stayed with us. The image of those deliberate hoof prints circling Mark's tent was a physical manifestation of the mystery. And Mark's unwavering description of the sound he heard, a sound that didn't quite match the physical evidence, was the lingering hook of the horror. Was it just a cow, whose natural sounds were distorted by distance, fear, and the echo chamber of a nylon tent? Or was there something else out there, something that walked with the weight and deliberation Mark described, and the cow tracks were either a strange coincidence or, even more unsettlingly, a deliberate mimicry? I don't have the answer. We never camped on the farm again. Mark still occasionally brings it up, his eyes distant, the fear still present. It wasn't just a cow, he'll say, shaking his head. You didn't hear it the way I did. That sound, it knew we were there. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my quiet apartment, I close my eyes and I can still hear it. Not the clatter of hooves, but a slow, heavy, deliberate thud, 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 circling in the dark, a sound that belongs to something ancient, patient, and utterly unknown, walking the forgotten fields of my grandpa's old farm. And I wonder if the cow tracks were the truth, or just a convenient lie the earth told us to hide the footsteps of something far older and far more terrifying. My name is Thomas. I live out in the sticks, as folks around here like to call it. Not just on the edge of town, mind you, but proper deep in the countryside, where the nearest neighbor is a good mile's drive away, and the only sounds you hear after dark are the crickets, the wind rustling through the ancient oaks, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. It's the kind of quiet that can either soothe your soul or make the silence itself feel like a physical weight pressing down on you. Lately, it's been the latter. This old farmhouse has been in my family for 3 generations. It's sturdy, built with thick timber and stone, designed to withstand harsh winters and the passage of time. It smells of old wood, dust, and something faintly like dry herbs, remnants of my grandmother's garden and the endless remedies she used to concoct. She lived here her whole life, and after my grandpa got sick and had to go into the VA hospital in the city, I moved in with her to help out. She was a woman of the land, deeply connected to the rhythms of nature and, perhaps, to things less easily explained. She had her superstitions, her old wives' tales, and her quiet certainties about the world beyond the veil. I used to humor her, a young man fresh out of college, brimming with city cynicism and a belief only in what could be proven by science or seen with my own 2 eyes. How naive I was. It started subtly, just 3 distinct knocks on the back door, always around 3 a.m. Not the hesitant rap of a lost traveler, nor the urgent pound of someone in distress. These were deliberate, spaced evenly, and carried a strange finality to them. Thump. 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 Nothing more, nothing less. It would wake me from a deep sleep, the sound cutting through the oppressive silence of the owls and the night outside. I'd lie there, heart pounding, straining my ears, but there was never anything else. No footsteps receding, no car engine starting, just the silence rushing back in, thicker and more unsettling than before. When I first heard it, about 2 years ago, I dismissed it. A branch hitting the door in the wind, I told myself. The old house settling. My imagination playing tricks in the dead of night. But it kept happening, night after night, always at the same time. Always those 3 distinct knocks. I mentioned it to my grandmother. She was sitting in her rocking chair by the window, her eyes fixed on the dark fields outside, her face a roadmap of a life lived fully. She didn't turn to look at me. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and gravely, the kind of tone that sent a shiver down your spine despite the warmth of the room. "That's death knocking, Thomas," she'd said, her words barely a whisper. "Coming for your grandpa. He's ailing, you know. The veil is thin for him now." I scoffed, trying to hide the unease her words had sparked. "Grandma, don't be morbid. It's just the wind or something." She finally turned her head then, her eyes, usually sharp and knowing, seemed distant, looking past me, into something I couldn't see. "The wind doesn't knock like that, child. 3 knocks. It's an old sign. When death comes calling, he announces himself." Her conviction was unnerving. It wasn't just a superstition to her, it was a truth as real as the sunrise. For months, the knocking continued, a nightly torment that frayed my nerves. I'd find myself dreading the approach of 3 a.m., lying awake, listening, waiting for those 3 dreadful sounds. And each morning, I'd call the hospital, my stomach twisted with anxiety, asking about Grandpa. His condition fluctuated, sometimes stable, sometimes worsening. The knocking felt like a macabre countdown, a clock ticking towards an inevitable end. Then, last year, Grandpa passed away. It was quiet, in his sleep, just like he'd wanted. The funeral was small, just family and a few old friends from his service days. Coming back to the farmhouse after laying him to rest was strange. The silence felt different, heavier, filled with his absence. And the knocking stopped. Just like that. The nights were quiet again, save for the usual sounds of the countryside. The absence of the knocking was almost as unsettling as its presence had been. It felt final. Like whatever had been visiting, whatever my grandmother believed it to be, had completed its purpose and moved on. I started sleeping better, the knot of dread in my stomach loosening. I convinced myself that it truly had been related to Grandpa's illness, a strange, unexplainable synchronicity, or perhaps just my own mind playing tricks on me during a stressful time, amplified by my grandmother's old beliefs. Grandmother seemed to accept it too. She'd grown quieter since Grandpa's passing, her gaze often drifting towards the horizon. She never mentioned the knocking again, and neither did I. Life, or what passes for it out here, settled into a new routine. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons changed. The world kept turning. I started working the small plot of land behind the house, trying to breathe life back into the neglected garden, a distraction from the quiet grief that lingered in every room. And then, last week, the knocking started again. It was exactly the same. 3 distinct knocks on the back door, precisely at 3 a.m. Thump. 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 I shot upright in bed, my heart leaping into my throat, a cold wave washing over me. For a moment, I was disoriented, half asleep, thinking I'd dreamt it or that I was back 2 years ago. But then the chilling realization hit me. Grandpa was gone. He'd been gone for over a year. There was no ailing soul in a hospital bed for death to be calling for. The house was silent again, the sound echoing in the sudden void. I swung my legs out of bed, my feet finding the cold floorboards. Every instinct screamed at me to pull the covers over my head and pretend I hadn't heard it, but a morbid curiosity, or perhaps just sheer terror, propelled me forward. I crept to the window at the front of the house, peering through the gap in the curtains. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the overgrown yard. The field beyond was a black expanse, merging seamlessly with the dark line of trees at the property's edge. Nothing. No car, no figure, nothing moving. I moved silently through the darkened house, the familiar creaks and groans of the old wood amplifying the tension. I reached the kitchen, the room that held the back door. The door itself was solid oak, reinforced with heavy bolts. I stood a few feet away, listening, my breath held tight in my chest. Silence. Complete and utter silence. I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. It was locked, bolted from the inside. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, listening for any sound on the other side. Nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator and the pounding of my own blood in my ears. Could it really have been the wind this time? A random occurrence? But the pattern, the timing, it was too precise, too identical to dismiss as coincidence. And my grandmother's words echoed in my mind, no longer sounding like quaint superstition but like a dire prophecy. Death knocking. But if not for Grandpa, who was it for? That first night, I stayed up until dawn, nursing a mug of cold coffee, jumping at every creak of the house. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky with pale light, the fear receded slightly, replaced by exhaustion and a desperate need for a rational explanation. I checked the back door in the daylight. No marks, no scratches, nothing to indicate anything had been there. The garden path outside was undisturbed. I spent the day trying to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, a residual fear from the past. I threw myself into working the garden, the physical labor a welcome distraction. But as dusk began to fall, casting long, deepening shadows, the unease began to creep back in. The silence of the house felt different now, not peaceful, but watchful. I made dinner, went through the motions of a normal evening, all the while acutely aware of the ticking clock, the approach of 3 a.m. I tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. I tried to watch television, but the images seemed distant and meaningless. My gaze kept drifting towards the back door. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, every nerve ending screaming. The house was a symphony of small, normal sounds, the settling of the foundation, the occasional creak of a floorboard, the wind outside, but each one was amplified, distorted by my fear. I watched the digital clock on my nightstand, the red numbers glowing in the dark, a relentless march towards the hour of dread. 2:58 a.m. 2:59 a.m. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I held my breath, listening, waiting. And then, precisely at 3 a.m., it came. Thump. 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 Just 3 knocks. Distinct. Deliberate. On the back door. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. Something that knew exactly when and where to knock. Something that had come back. And I had no idea what it wanted. The 3 knocks echoed in the silence, not just in the room, but in my head. My blood ran cold, freezing me in place. It wasn't fear like jumping at a sudden noise. It was a primal, bone-deep terror that rooted me to the spot. My eyes were fixed on the back door, that solid, innocuous piece of wood that suddenly felt like the only barrier between me and something utterly unknown and horrifying. Thump. 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 A beat passed. Then another. Nothing else. No further knocks, no sound of anything lingering outside. Just the reassertion of the oppressive silence that now felt pregnant with menace. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear something, anything, that could explain it. A car pulling away, footsteps on the gravel path, even the rustle of leaves from someone trying to hide. But there was nothing. Slowly, tentatively, I moved towards the window again, the one that looks out over the back garden towards the woods. My hands were shaking as I parted the curtains, peering out into the inky blackness. The sliver of moon offered minimal light. Shadows danced and shifted under the barely perceptible breeze, but they were just shadows. Nothing human, nothing animal, nothing identifiable was out there. The garden was still. The old swing set a skeletal outline against the night sky. The path was empty. This inability to find a source was almost worse than seeing something. Seeing something, no matter how terrifying, would offer a tangible explanation. A prankster. A trespasser. A disturbed individual. But nothing? Nothing suggested whatever was doing this wasn't bound by the same rules of physics that I was. Sleep was, of course, impossible for the rest of the night. I paced the house, rechecking the locks on all the doors and windows multiple times, though I knew logically that if something could appear and knock at 3 a.m. with no trace, a simple lock wasn't going to stop it. My grandmother's words replayed in my mind, a sinister loop, that's death knocking. But death for whom? And why now? The next day was a blur of exhaustion and creeping paranoia. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the old house seemed deliberate. I found myself constantly glancing towards the back door, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it again. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the grief for Grandpa, resurfacing, was manifesting in strange ways. Maybe I was finally losing my mind out here in the isolation. But the night came again, and with it, the dread. I stayed up, sitting in the kitchen, the lights blazing, a futile attempt to ward off the darkness outside and the fear within. I held a heavy flashlight, though I wasn't sure what I'd do if I actually saw something. Confronting death with a flashlight seemed particularly absurd. As 3 a.m. approached, the air in the room seemed to thicken, to grow heavy and cold. The silence outside was absolute, the crickets and wind seemingly holding their breath. And then, on the stroke of 3, it came again. Thump. 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 Louder this time, or perhaps it just sounded louder in the terrifying silence. It felt like it wasn't just on the door, but resonating through the house, through the floorboards, through my very bones. I flinched, pressing myself back against the counter, the flashlight clattering to the floor. I forced myself to act this time. As soon as the third knock finished, I lunged for the back door. My hand fumbled with the bolt, my fingers clumsy with fear. I wrenched it open and threw the door wide, stepping out onto the small back porch, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a pathetic tremor in the vast night. "Who's there?" The beam swept across the porch, the steps, the small, unkempt garden area. Nothing. Just the dew-kissed leaves of the overgrown bushes, the silent, empty space. I ran down the steps, shining the light frantically around the immediate area. I checked the base of the door for marks, the ground for footprints. The soil was firm, undisturbed. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Standing there in the cold night air, the silence pressing in on me, I felt a profound sense of helplessness. How could something knock so distinctly, so physically, and leave no trace? It defied logic. It defied reality. Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated itself. The 3 knocks at 3 a.m., sharp and clear, always on the back door. And always, when I checked, there was nothing there. My sleep deprivation reached critical levels. During the day, I was jumpy, irritable, my thoughts cycling endlessly between frantic attempts at rational explanation and terrifying leaps into the supernatural. The isolation that I had once found peaceful now felt like a cage. There was no one to talk to about this, no one who would believe me. My grandmother was gone, and her strange certainty about death felt less like a comforting belief system and more like a terrifying insight into the true nature of the world. I started noticing other things, subtle at first. A floorboard creaking upstairs when I knew I was alone on the ground floor. A door I was sure I'd closed found slightly ajar later. Objects that weren't where I'd left them. Small things that, when viewed through the lens of the nightly terror, took on a sinister significance. Was the thing that knocked now inside the house during the day? Was it watching me? One evening, sitting in the living room as dusk settled, I saw a movement in my peripheral vision, near the hallway leading to the back of the house. A fleeting shadow, darker than the deepening twilight, seemed to detach itself from the wall and melt back into the gloom. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the familiar furniture, the gathering shadows. My mind playing tricks, I told myself. Just exhaustion and fear. But the incidents continued. The feeling of being watched became constant. I started leaving lights on throughout the house, a futile attempt to push back the encroaching darkness. I ate standing up, pacing, unable to sit still. The back door became a focal point of my fear, a symbol of the intrusion into my once safe home. I tried covering the back door with a heavy blanket, thinking that maybe blocking the sound would help. That night, the knocking was muffled but still audible, the sound seeming to permeate the very walls. It felt like a taunt. It knew what I was doing. I even tried sleeping in the living room, as far away from the back door as possible. I curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying desperately to find sleep. The house was utterly silent, the silence of a predator waiting. My eyes were glued to the clock on the wall. 2:58 a.m. 2:59 a.m. The air grew colder, colder than it had any right to be inside a closed house. A deep chill seemed to emanate from the direction of the kitchen. 3 a.m. Thump. 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 It wasn't just at the back door this time. It was louder, much louder, as if whatever was knocking was now right outside the living room wall, on the other side of the window, or even on the front door. No! My attention was pulled back to the kitchen. The sound was still coming from that direction, but it felt amplified, closer, more urgent. And then I heard something else. A sound that wasn't a knock, but a soft, scraping noise, coming from the back door itself. It was the sound of something running along, sharp nail or claw down the wood, slowly, deliberately, from top to bottom. The blood drained from my face. This was no longer just knocking. This was something else. Something patient. Something persistent. Something that was no longer content to just announce itself from the outside. It was trying to get in. And it sounded like it was starting to lose its patience. The scraping sound. It was low, grinding, a sound of something hard and sharp being dragged slowly down rough wood. It wasn't a tree branch, it was too deliberate, too focused. And it was immediately, undeniably, terrifyingly clear that this thing, whatever it was no longer just knocking. It was testing the barrier. It was trying to get in. I scrambled backwards on the living room floor, pressing myself into the corner between the couch and the wall. My heart was a frantic, irregular drum against my ribs, threatening to beat its way out of my chest. My eyes were wide, fixed on the dark hallway leading towards the kitchen and the back door. The scraping stopped, replaced by the heavy, charged silence that now seemed a permanent resident of this house. But the silence didn't last. This time, the knocking didn't wait for the precise stroke of 3 a.m. It started again just moments after the scraping stopped, but it was different. It wasn't the measured, deliberate thump. 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 From before. This was faster, harder, more frantic. Thump, thump, thump. A rapid, aggressive series of impacts that sounded like fists, heavy stones, or something worse, slamming against the wood with terrifying force. Each blow echoed through the house, rattling the windows in their frames. It sounded like the door was going to splinter and burst inward at any second. I could hear the old wood groaning in protest, the hinges straining. This was no longer a subtle announcement, it was a brutal assault. I covered my ears with my hands, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to block out the horrifying sounds, but it was useless. They penetrated everything, vibrating in my bones, in my teeth. I could almost feel the impact from here. And then, amidst the frantic knocking, I heard another sound. A low growl, deep and guttural, seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something primal and monstrous, filled with a chilling, patient rage. I lay there, frozen, for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The assault on the door continued intermittently, sometimes pausing, only to resume with renewed ferocity. The scraping sound returned too, interspersed with the knocking, a sickening duet of destruction. It sounded like whatever was out there was clawing, tearing, trying to rip its way through the barrier. My mind was a storm of terror and disbelief. This was happening. This wasn't a dream, wasn't a hallucination. There was something outside my back door, something malevolent and persistent, and it was actively trying to break into my home. My grandmother's words echoed again, but now they felt less like a description of a natural process and more like a warning about something monstrous. Was this death? Or was it something else, something that used death as a calling card? The sheer terror began to give way to a desperate, animalistic urge to survive. I couldn't stay here, cowering, waiting for the door to give way. I had to do something. But what? Flee? Where would I go in the middle of the night, miles from the nearest neighbor, with whatever this was potentially right outside? I crawled silently across the living room floor, keeping low, trying not to make a sound that might draw its attention. I reached the front door. It felt like an insurmountable distance. My hands fumbled with the locks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had the deadbolt undone, my hand on the doorknob, ready to bolt out into the night, when the sound from the back of the house changed again. The frantic knocking and scraping stopped abruptly. The growling ceased. A sudden, absolute silence fell over the house again. My hand froze on the doorknob. What was happening? Had it given up? Gone away? A flicker of fragile hope ignited, quickly extinguished by a surge of cold dread. This silence felt different from the earlier ones. This felt like the silence of a predator that had stopped stalking and was now just waiting. Or perhaps it had found another way in. I stood by the front door, straining my ears, every muscle tense. The house was unnervingly still. No creaks, no groans, not even the sound of my own breathing seemed loud enough to break the tension. And then I heard it. A faint sound, coming from inside the house. Not from the back door area this time, but from somewhere deeper within, maybe upstairs, or down the hallway towards the bedrooms. It was a soft, rhythmic thump. Not loud like the knocking on the door, but muted, like something heavy bumping gently against a wall or furniture. Thump. 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 3 distinct thumps, spaced exactly like the original knocks on the back door. My blood ran cold again, this time a deeper, more absolute coldness that seemed to settle in my very core. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the house with me. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. My eyes darted frantically around the dark living room, searching for any sign, any movement in the shadows. The air grew even colder, a biting, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. I could feel a presence, heavy and malevolent, settling over the house like a shroud. The rhythmic thumping continued, slowly moving. It sounded like it was coming down the hallway now, getting closer to the living room. Each thump was a hammer blow against my sanity. It wasn't trying to break in anymore. It was already inside. And it was coming for me. I could hear other subtle sounds now, too, accompanying the thumping. A soft, dragging sound. A low, wet sort of scraping, different from the one on the door. It sounded like something large and heavy being pulled across the floor, something that didn't have feet. I backed away from the front door, abandoning any thought of escape. Where could I go? It was in the house. It was with me. The thumping paused. I could feel its presence just beyond the entrance to the living room hallway, a palpable weight in the air. Then, the thumping started again, closer now. Thump. 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 It was right there, in the hallway, just out of sight. The dragging and scraping sounds were louder now, horrifyingly close. I could hear a faint, wet snuffling sound, like something breathing heavily. I sank to the floor, unable to stand, my legs giving out from under me. Tears streamed down my face, silent in the suffocating darkness. There was nowhere left to run. Nowhere left to hide. The thumping stopped again, right at the threshold of the living room. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, for a long, agonizing moment. Then, a single, long, wet scraping sound echoed in the hallway, immediately followed by a heavy, resonant thud that shook the entire house. And then, nothing. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. Full of a waiting presence. Full of cold. Full of dread. I don't know what happened next. I think I blacked out. Or maybe I just stopped processing. When I came to, the house was still dark, still silent. The cold was still there, but it felt different now, like it was inside the walls, inside the furniture, inside me. I was still on the floor, trembling uncontrollably. I haven't heard the knocking since. Not on the back door, or the front, or anywhere else outside. But I hear the thumping sometimes. Faintly, from other rooms. And I know it's still here. It got in. And it's not leaving. I haven't dared go near the back door. I haven't looked out the windows after dark. I just stay in the living room, huddled, listening to the silence, waiting for the next sound. Waiting for the thumping to start again. Waiting for it to get closer. Waiting for it to find me. This is my home. It was my grandmother's home and my grandpa's. It's been in my family for generations. And now, it belongs to whatever knocks 3 times at 3 a.m. Whatever scraped at the door. Whatever thumps its way through the dark hallways. Whatever is now inside, sharing the silence with me. The countryside is quiet. Oh, yes, it's so quiet out here. But the quietest sounds are often the most terrifying. Especially when they come from inside your own walls. Especially when they come from the dark. And especially when you know they are meant just for you.